Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back to more Conversations in the Digital Age. With us is Sebastian Mallaby. Sebastian Mallaby is a senior fellow for international economics at the Council on Foreign Relations. He has written a sweeping account of modern financial history in a fascinating biography entitled The Man Who Knew, The Life and Times of Alan Greenspan. I couldn't put it down. The Wall Street Journal calls the book a tour de force. Martin Wolf in The Economist calls it nothing short of superb. Greenspan served as chairman of the Federal Reserve for 18 years from 1987 to 2006, succeeding the legendary Fed chairman Paul Volcker. Senator Phil Gramm in 2000, reflecting on Greenspan's deft handling of inflation, hailed him as the best central banker we've ever had. But while Mallaby owns that Greenspan was the undisputed architect of American prosperity, other financial historians fault him for the regulatory passivity that led to the 2008 financial crisis. Sebastian, we're delighted to have you with us to talk about this extraordinary book. Well, congratulations, and tell us, how long did it take you to produce this work?
5 years.
5 years?
My children tease me about this. They say every book I write takes me longer than the last one, and this is not a sustainable model.
Not a sustainable model. Now, you must always be asked, why did you write a book about Alan Greenspan? So I'll ask you, why did you write a book about Alan Greenspan?
Well, when I got done with my previous book, which was a history of hedge funds, it was 2010. And I wanted to write a big sweep financial history, explaining why, obviously, presumably not stupid people, created a financial system that blew up so dramatically in 2008. And as I thought about that project, it seemed to me that the best individual through whom to tell the story of the making of modern finance was Alan Greenspan, because his public life mapped onto the 4 decades from the late 60s to 2008, when finance went from being primitive to modern, and then from modern to unstable.
Modern to unstable. Now, just to set the table, the Fed is much maligned and little understood. Perhaps you can fill us in on what is the mission of the central bank in the United States?
Well, the mission of the central bank originally was to do bailouts when there was a panic. There was a huge panic on Wall Street in 1907, and the private financier JP Morgan was the person who corralled all the big bankers in New York in his library and wouldn't let them out until they agreed collectively to stabilize the financial system. And after that experience in 1907, people figured, well, we can't just leave it to chance. We can't just leave it to there being a titan like JP Morgan. We ought to have a public institution, a central bank, that can stand behind the private banks and be ready with liquidity if there's a run on the banking system. So that was the original purpose of the Fed. And then it's evolved so that inflation stabilization and broader financial stabilization has become part of the mission as well.
Now, how does the Fed go about curbing inflation, stabilizing inflation, as you put it?
Well, basically, if the inflation is going up, it's normally because too much money is chasing too few goods, too much demand. And so you have to reduce the spending, that is the demand, by making it more expensive to borrow. And if it's more expensive to borrow because interest rates are higher, then households will borrow less to spend, companies will borrow less to invest, and you'll cool down the whole system and get rid of the inflation.
And the Fed does this by setting the short-term interest rate.
That's right. They raise the short-term interest rate, and then that ripples through the other interest rates, the 2-year, the 5-year, the 10-year, and makes borrowing more expensive.
Now, do they just periodically raise or lower the interest rate, or do they telegraph their punch and say, in the coming year, we're going to raise it 25 basis points?
That's a fascinating question because the practice has evolved over time. It used to be that central bankers made a virtue of surprise and secrecy, and they wouldn't even tell you after they decided to raise the interest rates. They would just instruct the dealers in the New York Fed to buy or sell securities to move the interest rate around without even announcing it. But increasingly, the Fed has decided that it's good to telegraph this stuff in advance. So now, at the time of every meeting, the Fed puts out the forecast of each of its policymakers, and this is called the dots plot, where they say in advance how many rate increases they're expecting in the next 12 months.
Was this a Greenspan innovation?
Greenspan presided over some of that transition, They, in the Greenspan period, began to announce every time they'd made the rate change instead of keeping that quiet. And then towards the end of the Greenspan period, they began to telegraph what rate they expected to move the interest rate at. But it's become more and more explicit since Greenspan's time.
Now, during the Greenspan era, we experienced a period of asset bubbles. Here you have a boom that may be unsustainable and the possibility that people may have their savings wiped out and their IRAs and pensions disappear. Is part of the Fed's mission to keep a lookout to see that asset prices aren't artificially inflated?
Well, this is the big issue I really grappled with when I was writing the book, because one of the discoveries was that Greenspan, as a younger economist, writing a paper that became part of his PhD, said that the central bank ought to fight asset bubbles. If the stock market was overvalued, they ought to raise interest rates to squeeze that air out of the bubble, and before the bubble got even worse, reduce it so it became less dangerous. When Greenspan, on the other hand, was the Fed chairman, he did not do that. He neglected to fight the bubble in the technology stocks in the late 1990s. He did the same thing again, sat on his hands when the subprime bubble was inflating in the 2000s. So Greenspan decided not to fight bubbles, and I think that was a mistake. I agree, in other words, with the young Greenspan, who said the central bank should fight bubbles. I don't agree with the older Greenspan, who didn't do it.
But he did go in for some degree of jawboning, didn't he? I mean, he was famous for, maybe he didn't coin it, but certainly uttering the phrase irrational exuberance with respect to the stock market, and that caused the stock market to tank. Everyone followed what he said because, as you put it, he was the man who knew.
That's right. I mean, he did say that in 1996. He talked about irrational exuberance. The market tanked, but then it quickly recovered. And the reason was that people realized that Greenspan was almost doing the jawboning and talking about bubbles as a substitute for acting on them. So it was clear that he was not going to raise interest rates much to fight these bubbles. And so Wall Street quickly figured out that, gee, if a couple of speeches is the worst he's going to do, that's not terribly serious. And so now we have a green light to go crazy.
Greenspan was a Republican, and he was appointed as Fed chairman first by George H.W. Bush. And I think the Fed chairman is appointed for a term of 4 years, which spans the term of office of the president quite often. And he lasted 18 years, and he was there from George H.W. Bush to George W. Bush, Bush the son. That's a lot of presidents and a lot of time. Did his policies change over the years?
Well, on interest rates and on the central banking mission, it was pretty constant. I mean, Greenspan wanted to bring down inflation, he wanted to stabilize inflation. He completed the revolution that Paul Volcker had begun of transforming the US from a high inflation economy in the 1970s to a low inflation economy in the 90s and 2000s. So that bit was constant. But Greenspan was a great politician. In fact, I set out to write a book about the greatest post-war economic statesman. I quickly realized I was writing a book also about an amazing politician, because he was a mesmerizing Machiavellian political actor. And on things like, budget policy, Greenspan would be in favor of deficit reduction when that was the policy of Bill Clinton, and then in favor of deficit expansion when that was the policy of George W. Bush. So he could change.
So the Fed chairman is supposed to be independent of the president, but yet quite often he would bend to the policies of the administration in power.
Well, but to be fair to Greenspan, I think one of the insights I came to from studying his career was that the idea that the Fed can be independent just by saying, we ignore politics, we are experts, we are here in our ivory tower, that doesn't really work, because the politicians will come after you and they will push you around. And so if you really want the Fed to be independent, you have to be like Greenspan. You have to be willing to play politics. If you want to, be immune from being pushed around, you have to be able to push back sometimes. And I think this is a relevant lesson today for Janet Yellen, who, with Donald Trump in office, may be facing some pressure coming up. Pressure to cut interest rates because Donald Trump will not want her to raise rates and push up the dollar and so forth. And so I think Janet Yellen would do well to study the Greenspan model, of how it is that when the politicians come after you and punch you, you give them a left hook right back.
Now, there are other factors affecting the overall economy beside interest rates. Certainly government spending is a factor. Certainly there may be other economic factors. Long-term interest rates, for example, which the Fed does not control, only short-term interest rates. So was Greenspan mindful of that? Was he trying to get the politicians to do things so that he could fulfill his function as the watchdog of the American economy?
Yes, I mean, he understood that the budget policies, how much government spending there was, how much tax intake there was, these things would affect the performance of the economy. And so sometimes when he weighed in favor of deficit reduction, it's because he thought that that would really improve economic performance. And I think he was right. Other times, I think he didn't really want, for example, the George W. Bush administration to cut taxes quite that much and risk enormous deficits all over again. But he understood that resisting beyond a certain point would cost him politically and might cause them to come after the Fed in other ways as well. So I think he backed off for political reasons.
Now, he succeeded Paul Volcker, who was a towering Fed chairman, literally and figuratively. Paul Volcker was probably 6 feet 6 inches tall, and in fact he walked with a certain stoop, and he had the quality about him of an Old Testament prophet. I mean, he reminded me of always of Habakkuk, who was the depicted by Donatello in a famous statue. Now, how do you contrast the careers of Volcker and Greenspan? You do so in the book to some degree.
Well, I mean, the kind of classic comparison is that, as you say, Volcker was this lumpy, rumpled, egg-headed Old Testament prophet, who was totally ascetic and fought inflation in a purist way, whereas Greenspan was more of a political operative, more of a shapeshifter, less of a constant and principled person. I think that's all a bit unfair in the sense that actually, although Volcker was a hero on monetary policy and inflation, he was not so tough on the regulatory side. And in fact, if we think about the Latin American debt crisis stoked by crazy lending by the banks to Latin America in the 70s, the president of the New York Fed in the late 70s, who was overseeing the regulation of the banks that did all that stuff, that was Paul Volcker. And then Paul Volcker in 1984 presided over the first too big to fail bailout of continental Illinois. So Volcker on regulation was actually quite soft and less of a tough guy. And so I think the contrast with Greenspan is not so obvious. Greenspan was also tough on inflation, successful in bringing inflation down even lower than it was under Volcker. On regulation, he had a tougher time. He allowed the shadow banking system and leverage to get out of control. But given Volcker's record on regulation, it's not clear that he would have been much better.
So as every good biographer should, you delve into the persona of Alan Greenspan. Tell us something about his personal background and also his professional background. How did he get from the Upper West Side of New York to the summit of the Federal Reserve System?
Well, on the personal side, one of the things about Alan Greenspan is that he was not against marriage. I mean, he did it twice. But he was single between the age of 27 and 71.
Maybe the best of all possible worlds.
I think many people would say that's a slightly eccentric approach to life. But anyway, he was single in this interregnum, and rather a long interregnum. And as he put it to me, in this interim, he dated senators, beauty queens, and news anchors. And I would only say not always sequentially. So he had a big private life. He was a great dancer. He was a driver of ostentatious tail-fin 1950s cars with red leather seats and too much chrome all over the place. So that was on the personal side. We remember the rather dour, sort of besuited Fed chairman.
With large glasses.
Yeah, going on about, trucking capacity utilization in the Midwest.
Certainly not the sort of person every young woman wanted to date in high school.
Right, but in fact he was a dangerous jazz player, professional musician when he got out of high school. He didn't go to college right away. He toured the country as a saxophonist, and so he had that kind of musical side to him as well. So he was interesting as a personality. On the professional side, what I think is fascinating is that he was incredibly self-trained. You know, a lot of the ideas that he arrived at, he did in a very unusual way. He basically read a lot by himself. And if there was one big intellectual influence in his life before he got to the Fed, it was the libertarian novelist Ayn Rand, under whose spell he fell in his 30s.
He knew her personally, didn't he? And he invited her to a swearing in by President Ford when he was reappointed as
That's
Fed
right.
chairman.
Yeah. And in fact, passages of Atlas Shrugged, one of Ayn Rand's famous novels, were either edited or possibly even somewhat written by Greenspan, because the bits about the steel industry or about economics, she very much deferred to his expertise when it came to crafting those passages.
Okay, so we have the Upper West Side of Manhattan. We have, I've forgotten how you pronounce it, but we say saxophonist. We have the gay Blade dating television celebrities and television stars and senators. How did that affect him as a policymaker?
Well, I think one of the things of his skills as a policymaker was that he was able to get onto somebody's wavelength in a magical way. You know, when he was in the Ford administration as the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, one of his rivals marveled at his ability to get President Ford to listen to him and do exactly what Greenspan wanted. And he would describe this rival, he would describe Greenspan going in and seeing President Ford and saying, "Mr. President, this is a very complex problem, very complex." And then Ford's eyes would get big and round and start to go around in circles. And then Greenspan would say, "But Mr. President, I think I have the answer." And Ford would heave a sigh of relief and do whatever he was told.
So he's Rasputin-like. He was
Yes.
pulling the strings behind the scenes.
Yes, he had an ability to kind of make people depend on him intellectually, to turn to him for advice. And in this sense, too, Greenspan was the man who knew, the title of my book. He was somebody who rose to power because people looked to him as the guy who understood what would happen to the US economy if you took 5 flat-headed bolts out of it, as somebody said of him in the 60s. I mean, he knew every detail. And so he was the indispensable advisor.
Very data-driven.
Yes.
You've related his persona to his policy-making attitudes. But you write in the book that one of the things that wasn't in his personality was confrontation. He was the sort of person who would go around you and whisper in someone's ear and try to undermine what you were suggesting rather than take you on directly. Did this aversion to confrontation, did that play out in terms of his approach to the many red flags before that heralded the financial crisis of 2008?
Yes, I mean, I think it did. This is something where, I've debated a bit in print with Ben Bernanke, the successor to Alan Greenspan at the Fed. Ben Bernanke wrote a very nice, long response to my book. And his argument is that surely it can't have been Greenspan's personality that accounted for the failure to raise interest rates and choke off the bubble. I think actually it was personality. I mean, I think at least partly. I think it's implausible to say that somebody's personality doesn't affect how they think about policy, how they act when they are in a powerful office. And I think in Greenspan's case, he didn't like direct confrontation. He was a shy person, and he preferred to go around people's backs if he was going to undermine them and not do it directly. And when it came to fighting a big bubble in the housing market, to pop that bubble would have been to stand up and say to Americans, your house should be worth less. And that would have made him very unpopular, and Greenspan didn't want to court that unpopularity.
That really shouldn't have been. He could be faulted for that, shouldn't he? Because he was there to make the call, whether it was popular or not.
Yes, I mean, look, I think there's two sides to this. I think part of the reluctance to fight the bubble, as I've said, was personality. The other part, which I have to acknowledge as well, is politics. That the constraints on the central bank in terms of what politics would allow it to do before the Congress came down on it like a ton of bricks were real. And so, it wasn't in the understanding of what the Fed should be doing that it should pop asset bubbles. I argue in the book they should pop asset bubbles, but that was not the view of Congress or of the president or anybody else.
Now, he undeniably knew about the housing bubble in the 2000s. Of course, he retired in 2006, but by the time he retired, the crisis was baked in. He knew about the housing bubble. He knew that values of homes were overstated. He knew that there was tremendous leverage. He knew that the two government-sponsored enterprises, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, were in a lot of trouble, and yet he did nothing. Later on, he said this was a mistake, but you don't seem to fault him for that.
Oh, I think I do fault him, actually. I think I do say that he should have fought those bubbles with more determination. I think what's tricky, though, is that some of the things people remember as, the obvious errors, like, for example, why didn't he do more about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac? When you look into the detail of those stories, you see how hard it was to act. Greenspan in 2004 tried to make an alliance with the White House to persuade the Congress to cap the portfolio size of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, simply not allow them to do that much in the way of housing finance. And what happened was that Fannie and Freddie ran TV ads to scare members of Congress into opposing the Greenspan reform. And basically they ran TV ads with a couple saying, we wanted to buy a nice house, but our mortgage is going to be banned by those bad guys in Congress. So although I am critical of him, I'm also understanding of the political constraints, which I think people forget a bit too easily.
But what is the political impetus for predatory lending practices, which we saw in coming out of the crisis?
Well, on the predatory subprime lending, one thing that people also have forgotten, but which you can discover through the Freedom of Information Act requests, is you can read the transcripts of what the Fed leaders were saying about subprime in the early 2000s. And when you read this, you see, actually, they did adopt new regulations to rein in all this crazy lending. The problem was that they adopted those regulations and they didn't work. Why didn't they work? Because financial regulations are very easy to get around, partly because of the balkanization of all those agencies in Washington that are supposed to do regulation. So in the case of non-bank mortgage originators, little non-banks that would go out and persuade people to take a loan and then sell the loan out the back to some securities Wall Street house that would securitize it and make it into subprime mortgages. But the originator was supposed to be regulated by the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, which does not have supervisors. They only do enforcement if a complaint is brought after the fact. And so because of the way that the Fed could write these rules, but the implementation and enforcement of those rules was split amongst a bunch of different federal agencies, which were very weak and unable to actually do the job. So again, to fault Greenspan for this is a bit too simple.
However, he said that he relied on the markets and private enterprise to exercise discipline in their own interest and not to act improvidently or recklessly, as later it appeared they did. Was this an error on his part?
Well, this is where we really get to the heart of the whole problem. I mean, another meaning of my book title, The Man Who Knew, is that he knew that finance was unstable. He understood it was unstable. And when he said after the crisis in a famous congressional testimony, I found a flaw, and the flaw was supposed to be that, all of a sudden, he discovered that financiers might lend too much, that they might do things that would cause them to blow up, that would be dangerous. This has actually kind of been seized upon in the mythology as something that was really a novel confession of something that Greenspan hadn't understood. But he did understand it. I mean, I know he understood it because I've read all the speeches he gave and all the analysis he did through his long career. And he was constantly living through episodes, whether it was Latin American lending in the 1980s, the Continental Illinois blow-up, the 1987 stock market crash, the savings and loans disaster in the early 1990s, commercial property going crazy again in the early 1990s. The bond market blew up in 1994. Long-term capital management, the hedge fund, blew up in 1998. The NASDAQ blew up in 2000. I mean, he lived through all of these crises. So the idea that he found a flaw in the notion that finance was stable only in 2008 is crazy. He knew way before that of course finance is unstable. The problem with Greenspan is that he was the man who knew, but he was not the man who acted. It wasn't
So he was the man who knew who was not the man who did.
Yes, exactly. It was not a failure of understanding. It was a failure of action because of those political constraints.
So we've run out of time, unfortunately, because this has been fabulous. But Sebastian Mallaby, I have a question for you, and the question is, how will Alan Greenspan be remembered in financial history?
He will be remembered better than he has been recently, in my view. I think he'll get an 8 out of 10.
8 out of 10. Thank you so much for coming by.
Great to be with you.
Great to be with you, and thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations in the digital age. I'm Jim Zirin. Take care, and all the best.